It's time for Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
I'm not a Republican, but if I was, I would be extremely concerned about censorship in social media, which is a real thing. Censorship of Republican ideas and conservative ideas is absolutely a real thing. It's not just real, it's accepted as being the right thing to do by certain organizations. I mean, they've been caught on camera and hidden camera talking about the ways that you can silence conservative voices. For sure, conservatives are being discriminated against on social media by social media platforms. And even if you're not banning them from those platforms, if you're shadow banning them, if you're making it very difficult for people to find them, which is real. It's a real thing that they do. Like if you have a post on social media, it doesn't just go up in chronological order anymore. Now it's affected by an algorithm. They can, in certain social media platforms, use that algorithm to discriminate. So they can decide, hey, this guy keeps chirping on and on about Hillary Clinton's war crimes and all this. We don't need this guy around, okay? We don't need this guy and all of his right-wing bull and all his Make America Great Again bull. So we'll shadow ban him. And so they can shove you into this category where it's very difficult to find your page. And it's very difficult for you to show up. And a lot of people have seen their views drop drastically. There's a woman named Megan Murphy. Well, on Twitter, she wrote, "A man is never a woman." They told her she has to take down that tweet. So you know what she did? She made a screenshot of it. She took down that tweet, and then she posted a picture of the screenshot, and then they banned her for life. You know who's not banned for life? O.J. Simpson. Double homicide, armed kidnapping. He's fine. But this lady who's just said a man is never a woman, which biologically is correct.
Johnny and the Professor.
And another episode of Johnny and the Professor.
Common sense for senseless times.
Where we talk politics, pop culture, and Pop-Tarts.
Pop-Tarts?
Yeah, Pop-Tarts.
We're talking about the breakfast pastries, right?
Right,
okay,
exactly.
Just want to make sure that we're not going to get into a topic we shouldn't.
Why don't you introduce our guest today?
Well, our guest today is, for most of the people in Aberdeen should know, and if they don't know, then shame on them because they don't know enough about politics, State Representative Jim Walsh.
So what do you guys want to talk about today?
Boss Bill said I need to talk to you about HB 2042.
We got you in the corner.
So since he's the boss here, I said I better look it up. And this is a measure that recently passed that has to do with advancing green transportation adoption. Bill's main comment about it was he didn't like the fact that it's giving incentives to buy electric vehicles, but then they're charging you more in your yearly registration fees to pay for the fact that you're not paying gas taxes. That was his big issue. And I read through the bill last night. Translated through is probably a better way of saying it. And he's right, it does. It adds a fee every year to, I guess, to deal with the fact that there's no gas tax being paid by electric vehicles. But it passed with a massive bipartisan backing. I thought it was a very 5% or something didn't vote on it and voted against it.
If they didn't vote for it, they'd be shamed and shouted down as some environmental hater, right?
Well, Johnny's got the gist of it there. This was what they call a worked bill. This was a bipartisan, heavily negotiated bill, basically a compromise bill that combines some elements of a couple of other things that were floating around Olympia. And what it came down to, which is something we deal with a lot in political circles, is this was an alternate to some more radical bills on the same kind of topic, on the question of how to fund well, at the first level, it's about electric cars. But really, when you look at it and dig into it, this bill has as much to do with buildings, with building and the rules and the guidelines for getting building permits done, as it has to do with electric cars. It talks a lot about how certain public buildings and industrial commercial buildings need to have facilities to charge electric cars, and this was the real controversy, was how to do that, whether to just state by edict that all buildings had to have charging stations and facilities for electric cars, or would we do it in a softer way with an incentive and an encouragement. And the more conservative legislators who got involved in the negotiating this bill, and I was not one really, although I was aware of it when it was happening, pushed for more of an incentive, a series of incentives, and that's it applies to some of the car issues in the bill, but it also applies to some of the charging station and what they call infrastructure.
Right.
In this case, we're talking about building designs, elements of the bill. So it was, as they say, it's more of a carrot than a stick. It tries to use incentives to encourage building certain facilities in a certain way, rather than saying you must. And generally, people on the right will prefer an incentive system that encourages to edict that says you must or you must not. So that was the background on that bill, and it was, like I say, it was a bit of a compromise. It did end up getting very strong bipartisan support at the end, but there were a lot of people, myself included, who probably voted for it, but it wasn't the strongest yes vote I ever made. It was a good compromise package, not a great one, but it moved policy in the right direction. Most importantly, in the right way, which, as I say, was more of an incentive and an encouragement than a demand of the government. We should point out, too, that some of the fees that are added to the tabs, renewing your tabs on an electric car, in this bill were not included in the recently passed initiative that drops tab fees down to $30 again. So these additional fees on electric cars will remain, because when 976, the recent $30 car tab initiative, was drafted, this hadn't yet passed. So they couldn't, when they were drafting that bill, they didn't anticipate this increase to car tabs on electric cars. So this one kind of slid under the radar of the recent $30 car tabs initiative. It'll be interesting to see, and I've already heard from some constituents who aren't happy about that, who are saying, I drive an electric car or a hybrid, and why am I not getting the $30 break that everybody else is getting? And as you mentioned, the concept, broadly speaking, behind this is electric cars either don't use any gasoline or use just a little bit if they're a hybrid, and so they're not paying that gas tax. That's a major component of how road maintenance is funded, and so they sort of make up for it by jacking up the amount they've got to pay when they get their tabs renewed. Is that fair? I guess roughly speaking it's fair, but if you own a hybrid or an electric car, you're not too happy about it.
It's interesting about electric cars in general. I'm not 100% sure how I feel about them, because people go, well, I'm obviously going to be, dissed and cancel cultured, but an electric car the problem with is battery systems. The batteries that are built in electric cars require cobalt. And to mine cobalt always comes out poisonous when you mine it. And when you're talking about lithium-ion batteries, which is what they use, then you need rare metals. Well, most of the lithium in the world comes from Mongolia, and I'm trying to remember the country in South America. There's another one that's Bolivia. Bolivia in South America has most of the lithium mines. There is not enough lithium in the world to electrify cars. Period. You can't do it.
Yeah, it's a very good point that the rare metals element, and this applies to electric cars, it applies to some degree to cell phones as well.
Yes.
The devices we like that require these rare metals, mostly for their batteries and their charging, but sometimes for other pieces, are an environmental impact. The extraction of those rare metals is it can be a clean business, but in many cases, the way it's done, it's kind of a dirty business. And it is a little hypocritical for people who fancy themselves environmental activists to advocate for using electric cars and cell phones and such, and not acknowledge that those have an impact on the environment just as much as extracting oil for gasoline does. There's also it's an interesting thing. There are a number of options to the lithium-ion battery structure that is most common for cars these days. There are hydrogen fuel cells. There are a number of other technologies that are similar to the lithium-ion battery technology, do kind of the same thing in a different way, and one of the advantages that those advocates, people in that end of the technology are saying, is that they don't require the rare metals that the existing batteries do, or more common batteries do. It's important to point out too, anybody who's an investor in the company Tesla, I'm not, but I watch it, knows that Tesla, while people think of it as a car company, is really a battery company. And they just wrap their batteries in cars because that's a way to get the batteries sold. But as you know, Professor, and maybe some of your listeners know, Tesla's trying to get into the business of applying batteries, using batteries as energy backup systems for homes. And as I understand it, Tesla considers that an even greater growth opportunity for their company than just cars. And so it's interesting, the dynamics of what energy storage systems will be in the future. Tesla, probably our best known company working in that space, is committed to a lithium ion type battery, and it'll be interesting to see if these alternates, the hydrogen fuel cell or others, can grab some of that market share in the same way that the very smart marketers and advertising people at Tesla have kind of staked out in the in the consumer world.
Because they're going to run into the same problem we just talked about. You're eventually going to run out of lithium.
Correct.
And at hydrogen fuel cells, I've done a little reading on them also. Some of them require small amounts of things like platinum.
Correct.
Some of the more heavy, metals. You think people like their jewelry.
There's no free skate on any of this.
No, there isn't.
All the systems that can hold energy, whether it's for a car or a home or whatever it might be, need some materials that are difficult and expensive to get. What we should be looking at, I think, is a kind of a constructive engagement where we encourage the extraction of those materials to be done in a clean and environmentally friendly way. And that this is a part of the equation in electric cars that just doesn't get discussed at all, and I think needs to be. Because if we encourage extraction of lithium or platinum, or there are a couple other, I forgot them, a couple other of these rare metals that are required for these devices, if we encourage them to do that in a clean and clean way, it will make old gasoline look more competitive, because they're sort of getting a free ride now on not having the public attention that the effect of gasoline has. And what we may end up finding in the end is that old-fashioned gasoline is actually a relatively efficient way to use energy. And this will come as a shock to some people who very sanctimoniously consider themselves an elite, and they think that an electric car by itself is virtuous and better. Wouldn't it be ironic if it turns out that a relatively fuel-efficient V6 car is pretty darn efficient? Some of the radical environmentalists, of whom I've been critical and I battle with in Olympia all the time, like to talk about life cycle impacts. They want to see the environmental effects of a fuel or a material that we use for making consumer goods. They want to see the life cycle effect on the environment, everything from digging it out of the ground to processing it in a factory to using it in your home to sending it to a landfill or a dump when you're done using it. They want to see the environmental impacts of the whole cycle of this material. But they demand that selectively. They don't look at the same life cycle effects of a battery in your cell phone or a battery in a car. And if they did, I think you're right. I think they would see that a lot of these technologies are dirtier than the advertisers make them seem.
If your idea is you think, okay, CO2 is a dangerous thing and it's going to create global warming, and that's a whole other argument, we can get into that, but then you want to have no carbon footprint. Okay, well then logically you should be promoting power sources that will not produce carbon. And yet Washington has an advantage of that. Most of our energy comes from hydroelectric power.
It is one of our great economic advantages in the world.
Exactly.
Is we've got good hydroelectric power in this area.
But if you're not in those areas, the logical choice would be, if you don't want to have carbon emissions, and you want to have nuclear power then.
Absolutely. People who will talk about a green agenda and are not open to nuclear power are not serious people.
No, they're blowing smoke. Is my
and there's a lot of smoke blown in this area. There's no doubt that talk about green agenda, Green New Deal, is great for politicals' fundraising.
Right.
It is as cynical as it can be, because when they talk green and they send out their little flyer, send me $100 to battle the corporations, those direct mail pieces are very effective. They raise a lot of money on that. And it's much harder to say, well, some of the petroleum companies are actually pretty good about advancing low carbon effects. That doesn't raise so much money in direct mail. So they go for the money.
But do they use recycled paper, though? That'd be the question. But anyway.
Probably not. Very expensive, shiny stuff from what I've seen.
Because it is a ludicrous idea. People talk about this, and they don't want to actually have the solution to the problem. Because until we actually develop fusion power, I've been reading articles on that recently, and have seen some. I'd like to see it before I die.
Yeah, you probably will. The military's been working on it. The Navy, particularly, has been working on fusion reactors. And what was it, about 10 years ago or so, there was kind of some hype around this idea that some scientists had figured out how to do what they called cold fusion. It turned out to be more hype than real. But there are a number of small companies, small individuals who are working on fusion technology as an alternative to fission, the standard nuclear method, and they're making small progress. So I think you will see fusion as a practical technology at some point soon.
The magnetic bottle technology, which is the idea for the viewer's sake, anybody doesn't know about fusion, it's what the sun creates is fusion. It's the process where matter is fused into a higher form, hydrogen into helium.
Yeah, you cram atoms together as opposed to splitting them apart.
Exactly.
And the part that we mastered, back with Einstein and Oppenheimer, was splitting them apart.
Right.
The nuclear power we know is splitting atoms apart, but the real power and the efficiency is cramming them together and generating the same the heat and energy from that. And that's, as you say, it's what the sun does. And if we can get that technology, it'll be good for us too. You see it in popular media too. The Iron Man movies,
right.
Basically the source of his power was a fusion reactor. He made it the size of like a silver dollar and was able to run his suit off of that.
I've always thought that this whole Green Deal and the environment, we're going to die in 12 years and blah, 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 blah. The argument should be between climate scientists who believe we have a problem and the climate scientists that don't think we have a problem. But then all these other, non-climate scientists and politicians and special interest groups are all chiming in, trying to get their attention or their subsidy or their vote. What's your opinion on this whole thing?
Well, I go back, the professor was going back to the 70s. I'll go farther. I'll go back to the beginning of the last century, the 1910s and 20s.
Wow.
This is a debate as old as Teddy Roosevelt. And back then you had Teddy Roosevelt, you had Gifford Pinchot, and you had John Muir.
Right.
And they were kind of the three. Really, it was Pinchot and Muir, but Roosevelt tagged into that a little bit because he was a politician. And basically it was that split early in that century of how we thought about taking care of our environment. And in those days, you had the split between the conservationists and the preservationists. And Pinchot and Roosevelt were on the conservation side,
right.
And Muir was on the preservation side. And Muir was the guy who was kind of he was the left winger of his day, and he pushed a very large political agenda of what he wanted. Some of it was making wilderness, but he also had a lot of other stuff he wanted to do that was pretty left wing. And Roosevelt and Pinchot were what I consider myself, and I think many people in this area consider themselves, which are conservationists. That is, we want public lands particularly, but all land, to be kept in good, clean, usable condition.
Right.
For the use, sometimes commercial use, but usually personal use of the citizens of the place. And that does not mean keeping our land in some very narrow sense of a wilderness condition. A lot of the left-wing radicals talk about wilderness condition or pristine condition. And what that is that's really a condition that never really has existed.
No.
It's a what they consider a wild and untouched condition that as long as there have been humans and animals basically roaming the earth, they've managed timberlands in some manner. You know, the native tribes to this area were doing controlled burns and managing timberland. You know,
nature does control burns.
And nature does control burns,
right.
sometimes not so controlled. But the tribes like to talk about time immemorial, and as long as there have been humans here to time immemorial, they've been managing timberland in this area, and sometimes with controlled burns, sometimes with harvest. That means cutting trees down and using the wood to make dugout canoes or build houses or do whatever. So the image, this ideal that the environmental radicals have of this pristine wilderness is really a false idol. It's a false image. It never has really existed. And back in those days, in the early 1900s, when it was Roosevelt and Pinchot versus Muir, Roosevelt and Pinchot kind of won. And the concept that we have today of national parks comes from their idea of managing public land and timberland in ways that makes it accessible and usable by the people.
Right.
And that's what we need to get back to. We need to stop this idea of locking up these public lands, and to some degree even privately owned lands, into wilderness. It's a false dream. And again, I mean, this gets back to political agendas and fundraising. It's very effective for these things, but it's not good for people or the use of these lands. And we see this recently with this ongoing Wild Olympics. And the Wild Olympics people are pushing the old John Muir idea that
right.
locking up land, preventing people from hiking or hunting or fishing on public land is, good for, I don't know who, for their god or some other higher value.
Right.
I like to think that our public lands, whether they're federal, national parks or state parks, and in our state, of course, we have a very robust, or at least it used to be robust, and complex series of public trust timberlands that people have generally been able to hunt on and use for those purposes. But the state is supposed to run those trust timberlands as working assets, as working timberlands, to be harvested every 30 years or so, as timber managers would do it. And then the wood, the timber, sold, and the proceeds go to funding governmental activities, usually local. Right. Usually school districts, library districts, fire districts, local government entities get a lot of, traditionally got a lot of their money from that source. And we've totally screwed up how we manage those state trust lands. We've locked up a lot of those lands for the spotted owl, and more recently for another bird called the marbled murrelet. And it's a terrible thing that we've done. It's a self-goal. I was talking about soccer earlier. We did it to ourselves. The good news is, and this is what I've been saying for years and will continue to say, the good thing about screwed up public policy is you can fix it with better public policy. And we need to get back to where we were at the beginning of this state, where we saw with a clear eye that those public trust lands, some of which the federal government gave to us when we became a state, some of which we've had for other reasons, those need to be working assets. They need to be harvested and managed, or I should say it in the reverse order, managed and harvested in a good, responsible way. But they need to be worked, and they need to be managed and harvested so that we can take the proceeds of those timber sales and give them to the school districts and fire districts and libraries like we used to. And right now we're running different estimates or use different numbers, but we're running at something like 25% of where we were at our peak in generating money from those public timberland sales. That's terrible. That's a huge whack. And where you've seen it a lot lately, a lot of places are suffering for it, but the libraries have been suffering particularly for it. And the Timberland Regional Library recently talked about closing branches down. Now, ultimately, they backed away from that and aren't doing it. But they've had so much financial hardship because they've lost that timber money. And that's where they get their name. They're the Timberland Public Library System. they've suffered so much from losing that timber revenue money that they're laying people off and considering shutting down branches, and they don't know what to do with books. I mean, that whole industry is changing so much. People aren't using books the way they used to use them. And so what is a library in today's world? Well, we need to get them the resources they used to have so they can figure out how to reinvent themselves for the future economy.
When you're talking about Theodore Roosevelt, I did my master's thesis on Teddy Roosevelt. So if you like Teddy Roosevelt, you're okay with me.
Bully.
And again, our national park system that exists right now exists primarily, 75% of it was set aside by Theodore Roosevelt. It's interesting when you're talking about, especially when you're about working the areas and harvesting, from a point of view of the ones who were terrified of too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Young trees process out carbon dioxide quicker than old trees.
Bingo. Growing trees eat more carbon than old trees.
Which is no big surprise. A 5-year-old, compare the fuel consumption rate of a 5-year-old to a 50-year-old, and it's not they eat half their body mass just about to go around.
That's why the radicals talk about old growth. If they make old growth a primary priority, there's kind of no way to argue sense into that, because they'll tell you, well, young trees are fine, but that's not what we need. We need old growth trees. and they're very sneaky about how they talk about what constitutes old growth. As any forester will tell you, a lot of the land that these environmental radicals want locked up for the bird or for whatever endangered species they may be talking about on a given day, it's not real old growth. I mean, foresters know what old growth is, right. and what they'll tell you if you talk to any of them, and shoot, they're your neighbors and friends all around this area, they'll tell you a lot of what the enviro radicals talk about as old growth is not old growth. It's second or third growth, and they're just kind of throwing wood up against the wall and seeing what sticks, because what they really want is timber production shut down on the public trust lands. And they won't be honest about that, but that's what they want. So they're very sneaky, and that's one of the battles I have in Olympia is sort of smoking out the sneakiness on some of these groups and showing that what they want is not good stewardship of public resources. They want to push a radical agenda, and that is ultimately to shut down rural parts of Washington and rural parts of the country, and get people out of rural Washington and move them into the urban corridor, and
where they can control more of the political thought, where their votes no longer count.
It goes all kinds of bad directions.
Yes.
But I live here for a reason. My wife and my family and I like living in a small town in a rural area, away from the noise, away from the BS of living in a big city. And I think there are lots of people like us. I know there are. And we will defend our way of living and how we want to live and work. We'll defend it hard. And what part of that is calling BS on some of these agendas that are cloaked in environmentalism, but really they're not about saving the environment. They're about pushing
power.
Pushing other agendas.
Political power.
Political power primarily, yes.
More with State Representative Jim Walsh coming up on Johnny and the Professor.
This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
There's a guy from Nestle that doesn't think water is a human right. I mean, that guy should be hunted down and shot. Yeah. Right? Dude, this guy wants to own the rain. Can we do something about this guy? He was at Nestle. You're supposed to be happy. Like making cocoa for people. And this guy's like going, well, people are running out of water. What if we owned all the water and we kept it under our place? And in the future, when everybody's come to the door in a robe, slightly ajar, right? It's a complete animal. What kind of person thinks that way?
This is why you can't judge comedians. Do you understand what Guy was saying and how this jackass just heard it?
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com. This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
All of the people who are ascribed to this liberal, progressive ideology, the people at the pool who didn't like that you were reading my book, Deborah Messing, she's another Hollywood hypocrite. She wants to know who's attending a Trump fundraiser so that then they can let their producers know or directors know the people they don't want to work with. This is McCarthyism. We have free speech in this country. We are allowed to vote for whomever we want, but the hate is so intense. They have a plot to remake America, to shut down the right, to make sure that we can get as many legals coming in as 144,000 in 1 month. Give them a license and let them vote. vote.
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com.
It's Johnny and the Professor, and today we're talking with State Representative Jim Walsh. 675,000 Californians moved out of California last year, and they're all moving here.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we want to make sure if you...
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily a bad thing.
We just want to make sure that they leave their bad politics in California.
Right.
If you come here, don't bring Nancy Pelosi with you.
I don't think they understand that, though. They think, we'll just pass the same policies that we did in California and everything will change. It'll be different. It'll be better this time.
This time, exactly.
Right.
Definition of insanity, right? We'll just keep doing it over and over again until it comes out the way we want it to, even though it never worked in the first place.
I believe in common sense. I really do. I believe that your tagline is a good one. People who are protecting their power, political power, or other power, people who are protecting their status will try to tell you that politics and public policy is so complicated you can't possibly understand all the nuances.
And it's not.
It really is not.
It's common sense things.
It's a pendulum. We've had a pendulum for the past 50 years where we have allowed government and public entities, government agencies, to assume a lot of power and authority over our daily lives. And if you look back in the long arc of history, and Professor, you'll know this more than anybody, these things happen. They sort of follow pendulum swings. Exactly. Central governments get more power, then they lose power, and it goes like that. Well, we're at a place where the central governments, for my purposes, I mean Olympia, have gathered really peak power. Mm-hmm. They're involved in stuff they shouldn't be involved in, our state agencies. And we've reached that pendulum peak. And now the pendulum is beginning to swing back. And that's a natural process and ultimately, I think, a healthy one. But what we're going to see for the next, decade, couple of decades, is going to look like a constant battle on the infrastructure of state government. Well, that's not what it is. All it is a correcting move from a few decades of the state agencies gathering a lot of power. They're going to have to give up some power again. And they're going to have to give up that power to local governments, to cities and counties. More importantly, they're going to have to give some of that power back to individual people. Remember, if you're listening to this and you live in this country, it is a fundamental belief of this country that autonomy and political power lives in you. And you agree to give up a little of that autonomy and political power to your county, to your state, and to your country in exchange for those governments giving back to you some services and some physical goods, infrastructure, roads, streets, buildings that are good for your quality of life.
Security.
Yes. And civil behavior.
Exactly.
We were speaking a little bit before we started about the nature of civil behavior. That civil behavior, they call it a social contract.
Right.
You give up a little bit of your independence, just a little bit, but you should expect to gain back a civil society that helps you achieve more independence and a better quality of life so that the contract is a good one for you as an individual. We're at a place where we've bollocksed up the social contract and we've made it too large and too invasive into how people live. And so we're going to have to renegotiate the social contract a little bit. We're going to have to rein it in and get it back to where it was maybe 100 years ago, maybe 80 years ago, where the Department of Ecology didn't tell you couldn't build a seawall on your waterfront property. If you want to build a seawall and you're not obstructing anybody else's property rights, you ought to be able to build that seawall as long as it's reasonably safe and doesn't cause a catastrophe for anybody around you. The idea that you can't do that unless some biologist decides that there'll be no impact on anything, that's too much power in the hands of the state. What you ought to do, what our zoning and our rules on building things ought to do is assure that anything that's built is of at least decent quality, that it won't pose a threat to other people.
Exactly.
That's a reasonable exchange. But to say that any building you build has to have no impact on fish that are swimming half a mile away, that's not a reasonable exchange.
No, and when did the fish come and tell you that this is a problem? It's funny when people talk about this. Whenever we talk about anything happening in the government, they always ask the question, well, what is the financial impact going to be? What's it going to cost? But no one ever considers the other thing. What's it going to cost you in liberty?
Economists talk about opportunity cost.
Exactly.
And how do you measure that which you don't ever have, which you've given up in some other transaction? And that is opportunity cost is a hugely important concept. What do you give up to get the road paved? Now, we can agree, most of us would agree, we like paved roads. And,
yes.
And that's worth giving up some money. That may be worth giving up an easement on some property you own to allow a road to be built. Okay. But at what point does someone's need to express their sexuality in a public venue become a thing that you're worth giving up some of your liberty or your opportunity to achieve? And that's where you get into real questions, and we have these questions in the popular culture right now. I mean, at what point do modes of self-expression, whether gender identity or not, become so important that other people can't express themselves in the public arena? And who arbitrates which people get to express themselves and which have to be quiet and suffer? And this is all a symptom of government having gone too far. The pendulum has swung too far. Government should not be in the business of saying person X gets to express their inner self in a way that makes person Y uncomfortable and not able to express her preferred self.
And if person Y says something against it, they can actually find themselves in trouble. I mean, California's recently passed laws dealing with gender identity terms, and that there is actual fines that can go along with it. It's unconstitutional. It goes right against the First Amendment and the Constitution. But don't tell the People's Republic of China, California, about that.
Well, you talk about China. Look at what's going on now in Hong Kong. It is so encouraging. Now, it's still a bad business there, and people are getting beaten up. Some people are getting killed. But it's encouraging to me because you are seeing there the push for individual liberty and individual self-ownership and self-actualization, these important values that are fundamental to our country. You're seeing them growing in a totalitarian dictatorship that is going to have major heartburn as its people realize, hey, I have the right to own a house. I have the right to work the job I want to work, not that someone tells me I need to work. I have the right to have as many or as few kids as I want. I'm tired of these old men on the mainland telling me how to live. And the history there, Professor, this is important. Hong Kong is an island off the coast of China.
Exactly.
And it was run for many years by England. They had control of it from way back, Great Britain, way back in the sort of colonial days. And about 20 years ago, Great Britain gave up its control of Hong Kong, gave it back to China. And it's been like a pot that's been simmering and ready to boil the whole 20 years. And we're seeing now these people in Hong Kong who have been raised, younger people, but they've been raised in a more classically liberal system. And they believe that they have the right to these self-choices, coming up against a government that says, no, we'll tell you what job you should have and where you should live.
China is still Red China. They just dropped the red out and put on a suit. They've adapted the...
And it doesn't really fit any of them well.
No, it doesn't fit them at all. It's still the biggest totalitarian government in the world, and it is most oppressive of its people of any government in the world. I think it's encouraging to see the people in Hong Kong, though waving American flags.
Isn't that ironic? The kids who are marching in the streets of Hong Kong are waving American flags, and our snowflakes here in Portland and Seattle are waving Russian flags.
Right. Go socialism! Yeah, communism! Yes, that's what we should do.
Yeah, well, because I guess Stalin was such a nice guy compared to Hitler, right? Hitler's bad, Stalin was good. Well, if you have the leftists, that's the case.
Well, Stalin had a sharper knife than Hitler did, that's for sure.
Yeah, much sharper knife, because he had about twice the body count.
Right.
How does that work anyway? I mean, you got Hong Kong wanting to be like us, but then you have the Democratic Party that wants us to be socialists.
It's not having an understanding of the history, and that's a big problem. One of the reasons I don't teach is because I slowly found myself being pushed out of education because I was a moderate conservative in a college-level education. You're about as welcome as a leper in a jacuzzi at that point.
Technology is going to be the key there. Technology is going to democratize higher ed in a way that I think will open access to higher ed to more people, and it'll get rid of this, which we were talking about the Chinese a minute ago, mandarins. College professors in our country are mandarins, like in ancient China. Yeah. They are bureaucrats. They are extremely status conscious. And, the running joke always in academia was these battles for tenure and inside academic departments are so vicious because the stakes are so small, is the running joke. But the stakes are so important to these mandarins. They want to have that status. And for them, it's more than money. It's about standing. And the weird economics of higher ed have kind of allowed this. Well, the weird economics of higher ed are slowly breaking down, and a lot of these mandarins are going to be found to not really be as good at what they are supposed to be doing as we thought they were, and I think there'll be delayed justice, but there will be some justice for people who had to suffer through the political orthodoxy that was part of this Mandarin system. There's hopeful signs all around there. I just read a story recently that the students at Harvard Law School, the students actually got together and put forward a referendum or a motion. They were unsatisfied that the courses at Harvard Law and the clinics where they go out and do practice being lawyers were so politically biased. The students said, we'd like a mix. Toss in a few conservative projects with all these left-wing projects. And the faculty was kind of caught flat-footed. They didn't know what to do. The kids basically called them out on being partisan. So that's a hopeful sign.
Yeah.
And there are signs like this around. I mean, the UW has had some interesting things happen recently where the more conservative students are really saying, they've been sort of shunted aside and not given money that other student groups are given and things like that. And they're in the midst of a little bit of a revolution there at UW of saying, no, you've got to give equal time and equal resources to all student groups,
right?
Conservative and liberal. And I think you're seeing some of the same pushback, and that's all very hopeful stuff. I'm hopeful about this.
And they're learning to actually begin to fight boldly for what they believe in. We've had a guest in the past that was saying that was the whole point when you're looking at this pendulum shift back to a more moderate society, which means it has to move back to the right because it's gone so far to the left. But you're going to have to fight boldly every step to get there. You cannot be intimidated by cancel culture. You cannot be intimidated by someone calling you a name. You have to be willing to fight and move those one step at a time, and you'll end up with a better society in the long run. Hopefully.
I absolutely we will. Conservatives are the anti-establishment people now. I mean, you have, whether it's Kanye West or Dave Chappelle, I mean, people who are just looking for new, who are looking for something different and maybe a little less BS than standard are drifting to the right. And
independent thinking. That's all that's required. Thinking outside of the leftist box. That's Kanye West. The only thing he's guilty of is he said, I'm going to be an independent thinker.
He's a friend and supporter of Candace Owens, the young woman who is just absolutely shocking the establishment political order.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Mr. Collins, thank you for having me here today. I received word on my way in that many of the journalists were confused as to why I was invited. And none of them knew that I myself was the victim of a hate crime when I was in high school. That's something that very few people know about me, because the media and the journalists and the left are not interested in telling the truth about me, because I don't fit the stereotype of what they like to see in black people. I support the President of the United States, and I advocate for things that are actually affecting the black community. My grandfather grew up on a sharecropping farm in the segregated South. He grew up in an America where words like racism and white nationalism held real meaning under the Democrat Party's Jim Crow laws. And he has also had experiences with a Democrat terrorist organization of that time, the Ku Klux Klan. During my formative years, I had the privilege of growing up in my grandfather's home. It's going to shock the committee, but not once, not in a single breath of a conversation did my grandfather tell me that I could not do something because of my skin color. Not once did my grandfather hold a gripe against the white man. I was simply never taught to view myself as a victim because of my heritage. I learned about faith in God, family, and hard work. Those were the only lessons of my childhood. There isn't a single adult today that in good conscience would make the argument that America is a more racist or a more white nationalist society than it was when my grandfather was growing up. And yet we're hearing these terms sent around today because what they want to say is that brown people need to be scared, which seems to be the narrative that we hear every 4 years right ahead of a presidential election. Here are some things we never hear. 75% of the black boys in California don't meet state reading standards. In inner cities like Baltimore, within 5 high schools and 1 middle school, not a single student was found to be proficient in math or reading in 2016. The single motherhood rate in the black community, which was at 23% in the 1960s when my grandfather was coming up, is at a staggering 74% today. I am guessing there will be no committee hearings about that. There are more black babies aborted than born alive in cities like New York, and you have Democrat Governor Andrew Cuomo lighting up buildings to celebrate late-term abortions. I could go on and on, but my point is that white nationalism did not do any of those things that I just brought up. Democrat policies did. Let me be clear. The hearing today is not about white nationalism or hate crimes. It's about fear-mongering, power, and control. It's a preview of a Democrat 2020 election strategy, same as the Democrat 2016 election strategy.
Well, I mean, that's what makes this state and this country great, is we've always been a haven for independent critical thinkers. I mean, we were talking about nuclear power. I mean, we got Albert Einstein because you couldn't be a critical independent thinker where he was in Germany ultimately. You couldn't be there, so he had to come here. And, you know, we've been like that with some of the Asian Americans who were part of the recent move for referendum 88 on the last ballot. A couple of those people are literally Tiananmen Square students who were part of that uprising and immigrated here because they couldn't live in China anymore.
Yeah, no kidding.
They saw this kind of what was called affirmative action, but was worse than that was kind of percolating through Olympia, and they really said that's the kind of stuff we left. We're not going to support that. We're going to actively oppose it. And it was greatly encouraged. I was so encouraged to see that of people who, I mean, some of them, their English isn't even that good, but they got the spirit of this is wrong, and they got politically motivated. And probably the best from the recent session back in Olympia was the hairdressers. Do you guys know that the listeners may know? There was a very far left woman state senator who was pushing a bill that would have essentially ended, well, freelance work of any sort. And you'd have to be an employee to do any work for anything. And she had a couple of versions of the bill. One was broad, one was narrow, and it was directed at hairdressers, beauticians. That industry is the very standard arrangement. That industry is an individual haircutter, a hairdresser will essentially rent a chair at a salon. It's usually a woman, sometimes a man, but the hairdresser, will be basically an independent contractor, a little business.
Yes, exactly.
And she rents the chair and the space, but then she develops her own customers and does her own thing. And well, this bill in Olympia would have said you can't do that you, hairdresser, have to be an employee of that salon. You can't rent a chair and do your own thing. So this woman senator was running, the state senator was running this bill to really direct it at hairdressers, saying they couldn't be freelancers, they had to be an employee. They thought they were going to sneak it through. They were going to sort of push it through and nobody would notice.
Was she a Democrat?
Yes, she was a
no
Democrat.
Kidding.
Shocker.
I didn't need to know that. They would have been surprised if you said otherwise.
Well, the hairdressers got word that this was happening, and they were furious. And the hairdressers, again, some men, mostly women, they like being freelancers. You know, a lot of times they got a kid or a couple of kids, and they sort of do the hairdressing thing on their time, and they didn't want to be an employee and have to be there 9 to 5 or whatever. This woman state senator, the other thing that she wasn't very smart about was she scheduled a hearing for this bill on a Monday, and most hairdressers don't work Mondays.
Right.
So they were available to storm Olympia when they were doing the hearing on this bill that was going to really just mess up their business. About 1,200, maybe 1,500 hairdressers showed up at the state capitol.
Wow.
And they were fit to be tied. They didn't want this bill. Nobody had asked for it. It was basically a political agenda pushing it. And
so was it like sheer anarchy?
No, it was organic order, Professor. it like Edmund Burke wrote 200 years ago.
Exactly.
It was spontaneous order. They didn't have a lobbyist. They didn't have anything. They just connected with each other, showed up, and didn't they kill that bill? The state senator was so scared by the turnout, she withdrew the bill.
Nice.
And it was
nicely done.
It was absolutely the best sort of political engagement I've seen.
Why does it always seem like it's Democrats that propose these time-wasting, moronic, stupid bills, and it seems like Republicans, I'm sure they have their share of stupid, moronic bills.
There's stupidity all around.
Right, but it just seems like more, California, for example, look at some of the things. They just approved a law that would allow you to eat roadkill. They took time for this.
Well, they've got to find some way to get food to their homeless.
I understand that part.
Unintended consequence there. You're going to be Death Race 2000 for every deer in
And there's an app for that. They made an app for roadkill.
Well, think of it. There are more homeless in Los Angeles than Grays Harbor County has people. Now think about if all of Grays Harbor's fecal matter was being washed into the harbor here, what would it look like? And that's what LA is dealing with right now.
They're doing that up in Seattle all the time. They've been dumping raw sewage into Puget Sound right and left for the last 3 or 4 years.
Nicely done.
Johnny, you ask a good question. Why? I think this is why. I think because they know, the far left knows what we're talking about. They know that they're at the end of their pendulum swing.
I hope so.
And but no, it's going to be nastier for a little while, because as it really comes to the point, and as they start losing some of that political power that they've had in this state for 40 years, they're going to get nasty. They're going to fight. They're going to throw elbows to try to protect their little turf.
Their swamp.
Their swamp. Their little swamp. And so it'll be rough for a while, and then it'll get better. And it's already getting better, but it's going to be rough. There are going to be a few years where they're going to fight even harder than they've been fighting, because now they get the sense that they're losing that control that they had. And God forbid they actually have to talk to people and find out what people want and don't want, because they don't want that. They're so much smarter than the people. So it's going to be interesting. There's a new Speaker of the House in Olympia, State Speaker of the House.
They could use a new Speaker of the House.
And in Washington,
but that's another matter.
The longtime Speaker who just stepped down was a fellow by the name of Frank Chop, who has always been a man of the left. He's always been a liberal, and that's fine. But he was sort of a behind-the-scenes kind of deal-maker guy, and he'd split the difference with somebody and make bills happen. The new Speaker, he became too moderate for their caucus, and the members of the caucus were frustrated that Chop, a man of the left for 20 years, was making too many deals, and they wanted to fight more. And so they've elected a new Speaker. Now, we don't know what she'll be. Her name is Lori Jenkins. She's out of Tacoma area. We'll see how she is as the new Speaker, but a lot of the people who wanted the old guy out wanted him out because they thought he wasn't enough of a firebrand and enough of a fighter. It'll be interesting to see if the new Speaker is going to be a fighter or is going to be a deal maker.
Right.
And we'll find that out in January.
Jim Walsh, how do we get a hold of you if we need to get a hold of you or contact you? Reach out.
Oh, gosh, all kinds of ways. Email is great, and that's easy. It's just jim.walsh@ledge.wa.gov. You can also call my office in Olympia anytime. That's 360-786-7806. You'll probably end up talking to my great legislative aide, Carrie Dodson. She can answer questions and get meetings set up and really can help with a lot of what people call about and are concerned about happening in Olympia.
Well, Jim, thank you for being here today. We're definitely going to have you on again if you're willing to come back.
That's all great stuff. Let's do it again sometime, and let's just talk about state history. let's go back to the start of the state and kind of roll through those early years. There's great stuff back there.
If you want to contact our show, it's jpshowfm@gmail.com. Send your emails there, and we check it daily. And, of course, it's Johnny and the Professor on YouTube channel. And then I have my own personal national web channel which on YouTube, which is Arena of History. And I, of course, also write articles for the Senior Sunset Times.
This has been Johnny and the Professor. Politics,
This is actually what makes this whole thing so comical.
pop culture,
This is something that they're going to be prioritizing, and that is diversity. Now, this is stupid.
common sense in senseless times.